Hey there, my name is Brian Durrett. I am Church Council Chair at Ginter Park United Methodist Church. I'm also a member of the Side Door Band, and I'm also a teacher. I teach English to 11th graders at Freeman High School, and I also teach an Introduction to Humanities course to freshmen there. And it's from that course, actually, that I have gained some inspiration about what I'd like to talk to you about today. So I'd like to begin by answering a couple of questions for you. One is, what was Ginter Park United Methodist Church? Well, Ginter Park United Methodist Church was a group of people who began as a Bible study. Soon they grew to the point where they wanted to have a church building, so they left their location, marched through the streets of Richmond singing Onward Christian Soldiers to the location where we are today. They built an education wing first because they thought that's where the church was going to grow from. And then after that, they built a sanctuary, and that takes us to the place where we are now. I believe that's an incredible story for the beginning of our church. What is Ginter Park today? Ginter Park is a congregation that is dedicated to the church, but the truth is, I believe we are now at a loss of how to work towards the revitalization of our church. Ginter Park is also a congregation that has some really, really great tools and resources for that revitalization. We have a hard-working, dedicated staff. We have volunteers from inside and outside the church. We have a modern, powerful website, plenty of very usable space. And we have a Moeller pipe organ. We have all of these great resources and an incredible desire to put all of these to good use. We are also, and I'm going to use a term that we use in some of our meetings that the church leadership has, we are a church that needs to be rebranded. At this time, we are not as relevant to our community as we would like to be. And that's part of how we would like to work towards our revitalization, is to become more relevant to our community. What does Ginter Park aspire to be? We would like to be a place where people come to learn about and develop a relationship with God. We would like to be a place where people can come and commune with God. And to borrow a phrase that is used by a lifetime member named Jeff Roberts, we would like to be a model church for urban ministry. We would like to do as much for others as ourselves. Now, I believe that those are incredibly significant aspirations. But what do they mean? How do we decipher all of those? How do we do it? And more importantly, how do we get started towards those aspirations? I would like to suggest a way that we could start right now, today, by thinking about our story and ultimately writing and telling that story. Now, what do I mean by the word story? We know the stories of the Bible and the story of Christ. The larger church and our church is rooted in those stories. What I'm talking about is a unified story about our church. I believe it already exists, but my goal today is to hopefully help you think about it in a new way. I learned what I'm about to tell you about reading an excerpt from an essay written by an author and journalist named Joan Didion. She wrote a piece called We Tell Ourselves Stories, and she begins this piece with the statement, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." In this piece, she suggests that life just happens. It is one event after another with no real significance unless we create that significance. Waking up, taking a shower, eating breakfast, brushing teeth, getting dressed, driving to work. All of those things are part of our existence. But when we do these things, are we really living? Or are we just placing marks on a timeline? I want you to think about your life as just a line that you draw across a page. And the things that we do are these little tick marks that we put on our timeline. Are all of those tick marks really about living, or are we just marking points of our existence? How do we get from mere day-to-day existence, what I would call the rut we live in, to do something we would actually call living? I think we do that by thinking about our lives in a way that is ordered and significant, like a narrative, like a story, like the plot of a story. We select the events of our lives that have meaning and add them to that narrative. We do this unconsciously. In realizing we are writing our own stories, I am hopeful that we will be more conscious and intentional about doing things that connect with these aspirations of our church. In doing that, you are not just creating a story, you are actually creating a better story. I would like to refer to a book to explain what I'm talking about. That book is called Life of Pi. It's by Jan Martel. Now, I have to put in a spoiler alert here. If you have aspirations to read that book, you might want to turn this sermon off and not come back to it until you finish that book. And I highly recommend it. I think it's an incredible book. But I am going to spoil some significant parts about the end of the book. So if that's important to you, then just come back to this later. But if you'd like to stick with me, please do as I continue. Okay. Again, the book is written by Jan Martel. He is the actual author, and he writes about a fictitious author. And the fictitious author is told a story by a person named Pi Patel. So the book is this author's telling a Pi Patel story. In the introduction of the book, it says that Pi Patel's story will make you believe in God. I'm not going to give you enough detail to affect your belief in God, but I do hope this helps you understand the concept of what I'm trying to talk to you about today, which is the better story. So here's a quick plot summary of the book. Pi's family owned a zoo in India. Because of national and economic problems, they had to move from India to Canada. They sold most of the animals from the zoo, but they had to transport some of those animals by ship. During the voyage, the ship sinks and Pi loses his entire family. According to Pi Patel's story, he was thrown into a lifeboat with a hyena, a Bengal tiger, and an injured zebra. While floating in the water, he's joined by an orangutan. As the story goes, the hyena kills and eats the injured zebra. The orangutan attacks the hyena, but the hyena eventually ends up killing the orangutan. The tiger kills the hyena, and Pi has to use his skill and intelligence to save himself from the tiger. It's a paradox that Pi has to keep the tiger that is threatening his life alive so it doesn't attempt to eat him, which ultimately saves Pi's life. In this story, Pi goes through a transformation from a loving spiritual human to a primal animal that barely hangs on to his faith and his sanity and is able to regain his humanity at the end of his ordeal. It is his faith that keeps him alive. After 227 days, Pi and the tiger reach land in Mexico. The tiger slips away. Pi is taken to the hospital and he recovers. The details of this story are absolutely brilliant. I highly recommend reading this book, but this is all you need to know for what I'm talking about today. Now, there's a section in the book where the author explains what he is thinking as he is hearing Pi Patel's story, and it goes like this. I'm sitting in a downtown cafe after thinking. I have just spent most of an afternoon with Pi Patel. Our encounters always leave me weary of the glum contentment that characterizes my life. Glum contentment. This is that existence rather than living that we have spoke about earlier. He goes on to say, what were those words he used that struck me? Ah, yes, dry, yeastless factuality, the better story. These are two different things. Dry, yeastless factuality are the parts of our lives that have no significant meaning. The day-to-day, the rut, when we sense the essence and apply meaning to our lives, we create the better story. What is the better story? Jan Martel puts it this way. The better story contains words of divine consciousness, moral exaltation, lasting feeling of elevation, elation, joy. These are the things that move and inspire us. These are parts of the better story. It is also a quickening of the moral sense, which strikes me as more important than an intellectual understanding of things. An alignment of the universe along moral lines, not intellectual ones. I preached on this before. It's the difference between the head, the intellect, reason, and the heart, what your inspiration tells you, or what your stirrings in your soul. That's the difference, I believe, he's talking about between dry, yeastless factuality and the better story. So again, he says, a quickening of the moral sense, which strikes me as more important than an intellectual understanding of things. An alignment of the universe along moral lines, not intellectual ones. A realization that the founding principle of existence is what we call love. The founding principle of existence. This is a basic idea or rule that explains how something happens. How does life happen? Real life happen? Life happens because of love. Think about that. Some people say that the opposite of love is fear. Fear is the opponent of life. Life happens because of love. A story with this founding principle is the story that we need to write. It will not be written by going through the motions. We have to intentionally find order and apply meaning to the story of our lives and the story of this church. Most importantly, our founding principle of existence should be what we call love. 1 John 4:8 says, "But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love." 1 John 4:16 says, "We know how much God loves us, and we have put our trust in his love. God is love, and all who live in love live in God, and God lives in them." Our story needs to have this founding principle if we want to be a place where people come and learn about and develop a relationship with God, to be a place where people can commune with God, and be a model church for urban ministry, providing service to our community. Now let's get back to the book real quick. At the end of the story, Pi, the only survivor, has to tell a couple of insurance agents what happened to him. He tells the story of being on the boat with the animals. The insurance agents cannot believe this story, so they push him for the truth. Not admitting it was the truth, he tells them another version of his story, a version which he calls dry, yeastless factuality. The second story included the same chain of events, but the zebra is actually a sailor from the boat. The zebra is killed by the hyena, which is the cook from the boat. The orangutan is Pi's mother, who is also killed by the cook. And Pi is the tiger who ultimately kills the cook. However, this version of the story has nothing of Pi's transformation in it. And after telling this version of the story, which if you put all the pieces together is quite gruesome, he asks the insurance agents which is the better story. They both agree that the one with the animals is the better story. And Pi's response, "And so it is with God." A story or a vision of life that has a transcendental element is better and has more meaning and is far more impactful than one that is purely factual and reasonable. The story of God is not one we can prove, and there are elements that I even find hard to believe, but a story where God is present is a better story. So I'm not suggesting here that the story of God or the story of Ginter Park be a fabrication, reimagining of the story like Pi does in the novel. I'm not saying we should replace fact with fiction. I feel Jan Martel is exaggerating this act of storytelling to make his point. The story about the people is horrifying at best. He calls it dry, yeastless factuality. The only purpose it serves is to communicate a series of events, and the listener will be eager to forget that story. The other version of the story is the one about real life, real living, the struggle of actually living, the role faith can play in one's salvation. It is a story that contains the founding principle of existence, which is love. When you tell your story, are you focused on getting the facts right, or are you more focused on your listener understanding your meaning? When you write and tell the story of Ginter Park, are you thinking about telling the better story, the one that contains the founding principle of existence, which is love? We all know what Ginter Park was. We all know what Ginter Park is. I think it's now time that we tell the story that will guide what we aspire to be. I think it's important that we regularly remind one another of the better story. We need to be conscious of the story that we are telling to people we interact with, even our church family. I also think it's important that we share the same story. Prayer has greater power when shared by a community. I believe the same can be said about our story. Matthew 18:20 says, "For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name," and that name is love, "I am there among them." Whatever story we write by our actions and our interactions, both inside and outside this building, should contain the founding principle of existence, which is love, the better story. Amen.